So the question is, how does geometry explain self-esteem? Today we'll be looking at Spinoza's ethics, and more specifically his third ethics. What I'm gonna do is break this video down. Oh my god, what is English? I can't even speak properly. Le corps est le tombeau de l'âme. It's like Plato saying that the body is the coffin of the soul. Because I want to make this video, but I can't seem to be saying things normally. I will be breaking down this video into 3 parts. The first part is a rapid 1, 2, 3 of Spinoza, because I would be doing you a disservice if I talked about Spinoza without giving you the background of what is geometry, what is desire, le désir or conatus in Latin, and joy and sadness and how it applies to Spinoza. The second part would be what I call the logic behind positive thinking. I know it sounds like a super American thing, but follow me because, or follow Spinoza, or let me accompany you through Spinoza and tell you what I mean by that. And the third part, which is the really fun part, which is his Scoli. Scoli is a commentary, and I will explain like as rapidly as possible in the first part what all of this means and why we need to build up to this point to have fun, because that is the whole fun of logic and geometry. The third part, it is haters explained. And I know it sounds like ridiculous, but if you look at his language or how he explains things, it is so sassy and it's so lucid. The difference between Spinoza and the use of geometry and logic, it's kind of like putting together Lego blocks. You can make multiple combinations of Lego blocks, but the thing is, what we can't deny is the objective shape or the objective position of each Lego block that builds up into multiple variations. So that being said, let's begin. So I actually created like 3 squares that explains like the 3 things that I think are most fundamental to know about Spinoza. The first one is geometry, so enchaînement d'une manière adéquate l'un l'autre ou la démonstration. So geometry is basically the following one after the other in an adequate way, or a demonstration. So the problem with geometry, the first one, on ne voit pas l'horizon quand on écrit. So we don't see the horizon when we write. We don't see the lay of the land where we're writing, because it's just kind of like all this information that comes one after the other. And the second one is complexity, or prolixité, which is the flow of the information is so long and it's so continuous and so rigorous that at some point you're like, where was I, what am I even talking about? So that is a second problem with geometry. The third problem is that there is no direction. And the fix for this is the Scoli, which is what I mentioned about the fun part. So the Scoli, as in opposition to geometry, is to show where we're going. Montrer. Instead of démontrer, is montrer. As I said from the beginning, like, you know, it's really fun with geometry, but the thing is that it's not sufficient. And the thing that my tutor said about Spinoza, which is really interesting, is that he does both. Benefit of the doubt, philosophers just want to be understood, so they try everything in their arsenal to get you to understand, or they think that we're dum-dums and we just need help getting there. There are 2 types of geometries in Spinoza's ethics. L'ordre, forgive my pronunciation today, I just can't articulate. L'ordre de Gogh, the order of geometry, which is definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, scoli, and the point of this order is to procure the rational. The other geometry is manière de géométrie. So it's not the order, it's the way. This is something that he puts in front of his third part of the ethics, which we're going to be looking at. And this one concerns the emotions and affects. And this is why, like, in this section there are a lot more scoli and démonstration. It's more general prose instead of just the propositions. So to cap up geometry, the whole point of it is that it produces a sense of certitude. So now that we have a better idea of what geometry is, let me introduce you to le conatus, le désir, desire. It is l'effort par lequel chaque chose s'efforce de persévérer dans son être. It is the effort which each thing endeavors to maintain or preserve their being. Small context, right? But I asked the tutor about, you know, what is Spinoza's conception of life, and I just asked if it was about movement, because movement is really aligned with biology, and just to make this really simple, like, something is alive if it moves on its own. So movement is a sign of life. But in this model, in Spinoza's model of life, it is ontological. You either exist or you don't. I don't know if you've watched this like Woody Allen film where like at times his character kind of becomes transparent and loses opacity. So when I talk about like movement here, just imagine much more about opacity and transparency. Like the more opaque you are, the more real you are, the more perfect you are. And the more transparent you are, the less real you are, the less perfect you are. So when we say effort here, it is an inert model, and the effort here is to continue to exist without stopping. I know it sounds contradictory, but again, it's because I'm bringing in life instead of being. But I think they're interrelated, and I think it's just worth addressing. But if you have a question about this, just leave them in the comments and I'll try to address it there. So moving on, le bien et le mal. So le bien, I put it in red just so that we can visually see that le bien is more whatever is associated with joy. And le mal, I coded it in blue, which I associate with tristesse, which is going to be in my next little square that I'll be presenting. But basically, to preserve your conatus, to remain opaque and perfect and real, to augment your reality, you are trying to conserve the good, and at the same time to chase away the bad. And this is expressed in relations. So when we think about Spinoza, there is relativism, but not relativism in terms of subjective, not in terms of this subjective being or subjectivity. Relativism in terms of we are in relation with every other cause in the world. An item, an object, an event, a person, anything, a thought, or an affect that comes from another cause, another being in our reality, is accompanied either by joy or sadness. And that person is the cause of whether I am more perfect or less perfect. Again, this is going to be elaborated in my next slide. The quote that I added at the bottom that comes from the third ethic, ninth proposition, Scoli, it's a famous formulation of what he thinks of as values, and our desire is what determines this. Okay, I guess I'll just read it. Nous ne efforçons vers rien, ne... Oh my god, it sounds so bad. I can't... It sounds so bad to speak French with a blocked nose, because you need your nose when you speak French. Okay. Nous ne efforçons vers rien, ne cherchons, ne désirons rien, parce que nous jugeons c'est bon. We endeavor towards nothing, we search nothing, we desire nothing, because we judge that it's good. Mais au contraire, nous jugeons qu'une chose est bonne parce que nous nous efforçons vers elle, la voulons, la recherchons et la désirons. But on the contrary, we judge something as good because we endeavor towards it, we want it, we search for it, and we desire it. The interesting thing about Spinoza's thesis is that we can have desire before we have an object of desire. The goodness and badness is not within the object, but the goodness and badness is designated towards the object based on our desire for it, based on whether we search for it, and based on whether we want it. So okay, that is la conatus. So finally now I present to you joy and sadness in relation to désir. The imagery that I'm trying to use to try to help with this idea is the opaqueness and transparency. And when you're completely transparent, you disappear. But when you're opaque, you are fully present and real. So with desire, we've already said conatus, we've already said the effort, but another formulation is that it's our puissance d'agir, it's pouvoir exister. Puissance d'agir, it's our power to act. Pouvoir exister is the power to exist. And here's the relation, right? So with joie, so when our conatus is affected by joy, it is l'âme passe à plus grande perfection. So when we're affected with joy, our soul passes with a greater, larger perfection. And when we're sad or affected by sadness, l'âme passe à une perfection moindre. It is the lesser perfection. And perfection here is just reality. It's like more perfect, you're more real, you're more here, you're more concrete, you're more ontologically alive. And if we go back to the formulation of puissance d'agir, so when we're affected by joy, we're more powerful and it's more positivity. Try not to take this yet in the colloquial sense of being positive and being negative. But for now, when you think of positivity, it's just more of more and more things that affirms your being, your reality, your perfection. And impuissance is your lack of power, your weakness. This is negativity. So more things that negate your being, more things that actually takes away your self-affirmation. And it is the submission to affects. Now that we're done with this extremely rapid and really short 1, 2, 3 of Spinoza, insert irony here, let's go on to the second part of the video, which is the logic of positive thinking. Oh my god, I'm so scared. I've already shot for 30 minutes. Okay, let's soldier on. What I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna include all these translations and the original in my newsletter, but here I'm just gonna read through the English so that we can build on, so that we can get to the fun part, which is part 3. So here we have Ethics 3, Proposition 53, which is when the soul represents itself with its power to act, it is joyful, and all the more joyful as it more distinctly imagines itself with its power to act. The quick thing about like the word imaginer is that we have an image of ourselves. So it's basically the power of this thought of an image of ourselves. If the soul represents itself through this image that comes with this power to act of your own puissance, your ability to act, your perfection, the more happy you are. Because the conatus, by its own nature, by its own law, wants to preserve itself, it goes in line with your power to act, your ability to exist, and therefore when you imagine yourself as being capable, as powerful, you're more joyful, and then you're more perfect, and then you have more reality. And the demonstration for this is man does not know himself except through his body's affections and their ideas. When therefore the soul is able to represent itself, it is supposed at the same time to pass to greater perfection, that is to be affected with joy, and with all the greater it can imagine itself more distinctly, which is unmixed. You just have this clear idea of your affirmation in your being itself with its power to act. So what he's trying to say here is that we do not know ourselves directly. We only know ourselves through things, objects, ideas that brings with it joy or sadness. So with this demonstration, there's a foreshadowing of how my sense of self, my self-esteem, how I esteem myself, and my being is going to be affected by those around me. So let's continue. Proposition 54. The soul strives to imagine only what posits its power to act. Again, that's how our conatus works. What we've seen so far with Proposition 53 and the demonstration up to Proposition 54 is that it is our self-esteem in relation to joy. So Proposition 55 is when the soul imagines itself powerless, it is thereby saddened, which logically makes the pair, right? So it's like when you're happier, when you're joyful, when you affirm yourself, you are more real and you're more perfect. And on the other hand, if you imagine yourself powerless, which goes against your conatus, which goes against the natural law of wanting to maintain your being, you're saddened. And when you're saddened, you're less perfect and you're less real. So yeah, let's get into the fun part, which is la scolie de la proposition 55. And yeah, I'll see you there. So, haters explained, or Proposition 55. Forgive my French today, but let us begin. Scolie, cette tristesse qui accompagne l'idée de notre faiblesse, on appelle humilité, et la joie qui naît de la représentation de nous-mêmes se nomme amour propre ou satisfaction de soi. The sadness that accompanies this idea of weakness is called humility, and the joy that arises from the representation of ourselves is called self-love or self-satisfaction. Et comme cette joie se répète à chaque fois que l'homme se représente ses vertus, autrement dit sa puissance d'agir, il en résulte également que chaque brûle de raconter ses exploits et de faire étalage de sa force aussi bien physique que morale, ce qui rend les hommes pénibles à supporter les uns pour les autres. And this joy is repeated every time man imagines his virtues, in other words, his power to act. It also results in everyone burning to recount his exploits and flaunt his strength, both physical and moral, which makes men painful which makes men painful for each other to bear. I mean, that's so funny. So the sadness that comes from imagining your weaker self is humility. And I know humility, there are a lot of nuances, like have hubris, it's good and everything, but in this sense, let's just use this designation of humility as me imagining myself as powerless. And the opposite of that, which is joy, that comes from representing ourselves as being powerful, is called self-love and self-satisfaction. You're like proud of yourself, bro. And the second sentence is basically saying like, yeah, of course it's normal that you want to repeat this sense of joy, right? Like if it makes you feel more powerful to imagine yourself as amazing, like of course you're gonna be like, yo, like, you know, look at what I've done, like, you know, isn't that so great, to like the people around you to kind of like continue with this perfection, to continue with this like increase of your reality. But this is what he says makes us annoying to other people. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but it gets better. D'où de nouveau cette conséquence, les hommes par nature sont envieux, autrement dit, la faiblesse de leurs égaux leur réjouit et au contraire les vertus les attristent. Hence again this consequence. Men by nature are envious. In other words, they rejoice in the weakness of their equals and are saddened by their virtue. Car chacun, sitôt qu'il imagine ses propres actions, est à chaque fois affecté de joie et d'une joie d'autant plus grande qu'il imagine que ses actions expriment plus de perfection et qu'il les imagine plus distinctement, autrement dit, qu'il est plus capable de les distinguer des autres et de se les représenter comme des choses singulières. For each person, as soon as he imagines his own actions, is each time affected by joy, and a joy all greater because he imagines that these actions express more perfection and that he imagines them more distinctly. In other words, that he is more capable of distinguishing them from others and imagining them as singular things. Voilà pourquoi c'est au moment où il se représente en lui quelque chose qu'il nie de tous les autres que chacun goûtera la plus joie de à se représenter soi-même. So, by nature, men are haters. And here, okay, just a bit of precision, right? Virtue. So, in this framework, une vie heureuse et une vie utile. A happy life is a useful life. So to be virtuous is whatever it takes for you to maintain your being. But the caveat here is not just like, oh, I'm just gonna do everything that's just good for me. The thing that helps us most preserve our being is reason. It's our reason that helps us see things clear, to see like everything that happens, and for us not to suffer from our emotions. We are no longer at the mercy of any and every encounter in life that comes with happiness or sadness, thanks to reason. The second part is really fun because you go from like, you're like, yeah, you know, self-affirmation is like super great, you know, positive thinking that helps you like preserve your being, that's so great. It just reads like we overdo it. We overdo it until we're annoying, but it's not our fault. This is just what we all want to do. We all want to just maintain our being. We all want to just be joyful. The idea here is that the more you do it, you're obviously more effective with joy, and then you're more perfect, and you're so perfect to the point that even your actions start distinguishing themselves outside of other people. The most interesting word in this second part is singulière, which is singular. So one of the questions that I asked my professor for Spinoza was like, why is it that when we see something as singular that we get really affected by it? It's another proposition in the third part. A huge compliment in France is singulière. It's like kind of like you have your own way of thinking, you're not affected by other people, you know, you blaze your own path. But on the other hand, people who don't see this as positive, obviously I'm speaking from life experience, but for those who don't see that as a positive thing, it's kind of like they look at you and they're like, they can't really make you out. Like, they can't really like place you. And that's a problem. Like, why am I going through administration? Why do I have this like horrible situation? Like, why is everything so difficult for me? But for you, it kind of seems like things are just going really great. In that way, when you are singulière and when your actions look like they have no relation to other things, that they're not determined by other things, that they're in a way free, it kind of irks people because it seems like so outside of what is actually the human condition or what they understand as the human condition. And in that way, like when you do this, you're denying them of joy. And the last part of this sentence is really interesting in terms of like, why is it that someone experiencing their joy denies another person's experience of joy? And you know, you've heard that saying, right? It's like, sometimes when you have joy in yourself, like haters look at you and they're like bitter, they're like, And when you're the joyful one, you're like, why doesn't my joy spread to other people's joy? This joy that I have right now, it's like self-cultivated joy and it has nothing to do with them. So why are they being haters? So let's read on and find out. Mais il rapporte ce qu'il affirme de soi à l'idée universelle de l'homme ou de l'animal. Il ne se réjouit pas autant. Et à l'inverse, il s'attristera si, en comparant ses actions à celles des autres, il s'imagine qu'elles sont plus médiocres. Tristesse que, assurément, il s'efforça d'écarter en interprétant de travers les actions de ses égaux, et en enjolivant les siens autant qu'il peut. But if he relates what he affirms about himself to the universal idea of man or animal, he will not rejoice as much, and conversely he'll be saddened if comparing his actions with those of others, he imagines that they are mediocre. A sadness he will certainly strive to ward off by misinterpreting these actions of his equals and embellishing his own as much as he can. Okay, there are a lot of things that are interesting here, and I think like something that comes to mind for me is meritocracy. This idea that like, oh, if you really wanted it, you could have. Or simply put, like injustice, right? Like, why does it seem that some people have it easier than others? This bitterness that actually comes from yourself actually is projected to other people because this is how we survive. Let me explain, right? So if you see someone else look like they're not being subjected to this life experience, that like they don't worry about rent, and I always come back to rent because I think like, you know, shelter is not given. Okay, food's not given. We've talked about this in Bergson, but shelter is not given. And if a person looks like they're not worrying about, you know, where they're gonna live, how are they gonna eat, and they're enjoying things, and they seem happy on top of that, while I'm over here worrying about like all these things that they don't have to worry about, like, what is up? Am I mediocre? Are my actions mediocre? Why do their actions seem so free when mine seems so determined, and like, you know, everything and every choice that I would have to make next is not technically of my free will, but based on all the constraints that I have, whether I don't have enough time, whether I, like, you know, I'm sick now and I can't, like, you know, pronounce my R's, or, you know, anything that stops you from doing what you want to do because there is a bigger reason why you can't do something in comparison to why you can do something. And this kind of resonates as well with like what Rousseau says about how badness comes from society, comes from comparing yourself with others. Delete that social media account, man. Okay, my plug for that is over. But the consequence of this comparison, and I would also say this confusion that comes with comparison, because like, you know, it's really clear we say that social media makes us really sad because we know we're comparing ourselves to an illusion. Whatever people are showing on their Instagram is like, you know, the best version or a fun version of themselves, which exists, but it's like, it seems like it's the only thing that exists. That not clear representation of things. This is where resentment or envy comes in. Like, in a sense, we know. But on the other, it's kind of, it's not what I see. And there's this dissonance. There's this kind of, like, mixture of, like, this kind of fluey fog. And in that way, like, in regards to our conatus, which searches for the good and chases away the bad, it kind of causes this, like, I don't know why I can't say this in English, but déformation, like deformed image of others. We start misinterpreting others. And we start also, in a way, like deforming ourselves. We start embellishing ourselves. We try to do anything to kind of preserve our sense of being. And this deformation comes from this need to preserve our being. I'm gonna overestimate myself and underestimate other people because that's what I need to preserve my conatus. Il apparaît donc que les hommes sont par nature enclines à la haine et l'envie, nature à quoi vient s'ajouter l'éducation. It is clear then that human beings are by nature inclined to hatred and envy, a nature that is compounded by their upbringing. I chose upbringing instead of education, and you'll see why. Car les parents ont coutume d'utiliser le seul aiguillon de l'honneur et de l'envie pour inciter les enfants à la vertu. For parents are accustomed to using only the spur of honor and envy to incite their children to virtue. Mais un scrupule subsiste peut-être, but a scruple may remain. He's kind of like anticipating people critiquing him. Il y a souvent des hommes dont nous admirons les vertus et que nous vénérons. Pour écarter ces scrupules, je vais donc ajouter le corollaire suivant. There are often men whose virtues we admire and whom we venerate. To remove this scruple, I'll add the following corollary. So to cap off this part, he's summarizing why it is that we are inclined to hatred and envy. And this is something that's compounded by our parents. You know, it's like, look at what your cousin's doing. Like, you know, that guy made it, da-da-da. Like, it's not only us, you know, at whatever age, we're just like, oh wow, that person made $1 million at 25. Or like, at 17, they cracked this code. This comparison comes from our parents. It is always their fault. But in the end, like, our parents were children to their parents. So it's just this lineage and continuation of human nature. But he adds this caveat. He kind of tries to defend himself. It's like, how do we explain that they are, in the end, people who we admire? Like, all these celebrities or all these, like, you know, intellectuals that we buy their books and we watch their podcasts and we buy their products. And like influencers who like tried to ask us to buy like NordVPN. So my camera died. But what I'm trying to say is that like after all of that, how is admiration possible? So his corollaire says, Nul n'envie la vertu d'autrui sauf s'il agit d'un égal. No one envies the virtue of another unless he is an equal. It's such a loaded like sentence. This explains like why I can admire a professor or why I can admire someone else's journey that I don't consider as, you know, in the same path as mine or in the same level as mine. But the problematic thing about this for me is like, are people then not our equals? If you bring in Kant, it's like there is respect for people. You don't treat people as means, you treat people as like their own ends. And it's kind of like this respect for humanity, respect for humans. So this idea of like, oh, we only hate our equals, we only hate people who we esteem are equal to us, it's troubling, you know, it's problematic. But then I thought about it a bit more when I was like preparing this, and I was just like, no, it kind of makes sense though. Because if I think that someone's my equal, and yet they're not going through as much shit as I'm going through, of course I'm gonna be pissed and like angry. If I think that everything that's determining my life and making my life like difficult at times is like not affecting a person that I think is my equal in terms of everything that's affecting me, should technically affect them if we're technically equal. We're supposed to have like certain determinations in common for me to consider this person my equal. And in the end, like, what do we do? Like, do we not see people as our equals? Do we have like this hierarchy? Will that satisfy our conatus where we admire people but we don't consider them our equals or not our equals? My solution, I mean, it's like many things, or at least the thoughts that I had is that like, we are not equal. We're not. Like, we're all under different circumstances. The fact that you have Wi-Fi and the time to watch this video, I have the time to watch and make this video. We're not born equal. We're not all given the same equal opportunities. Meritocracy is a construct. It's all a lie. But what we have in common and what is equal about us though is that we all have this being to want to exist, to experience joy, and to avoid sadness. And that is why we need to remain empathetic towards other people. And I don't know why it took this turn, but that was the next thing that came out of my mouth. And also like, this is what will help us be kinder to ourselves in terms of that we know the comparison that we're making is an unjust comparison. That person is not our equal. Their acts are not singular because we don't know everything that determines that person. And empathy or reason that gives us this understanding that we're all determined and no one is particularly singular or distinct is exactly like what gives us this empathy. Once we understand that we are not equals, we're all not given the same opportunities, we're all not given the same shit to deal with life, that is the empathy. And to explain like admiration, it doesn't just have to be like an amazing person that like is very far removed from you. My solution for that is that like, you know, have friends who don't think that you're their equal. Like have friends who admire you and your way of being, and have friends that you admire their way of being, and that their way of being brings you joy and your way of being brings you joy, and you continue to build and reinforce your sense of beings together. Not with comparison that you can only do with this false sense of equality that doesn't exist, in my opinion, that we strive for, that we should always strive for, but we should recognize doesn't exist. But to actually just understand that everyone has their different strengths. We're not all on the same playing field, but we're all in this together. All I'm trying to say is that we're just trying to survive. Something that is not new to me. If you want to watch another video that I made, I wrote an essay about aloneness that I think talks about this. But I hope you found it helpful, and I hope this is going to be less than 20 minutes. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.